All right, so it is 3 o'clock. I am going to go ahead and get us started on time today. It is my pleasure to introduce Melinda Roden. She is a Colorado Department of Education consultant, and every year she very graciously agrees to join us for this webinar and give us kind of a review and an update on assistive technology accommodations as it relates to our state assessments. So many, many thanks, Melinda. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thanks everyone. If you've been with us before, some of the information is very similar to last year, and that's because for the assessment program at the Department of Ed for state assessments, which does include the CMS assessments, including the COALT, NAEP, PSAT, SAT, and the WIDA access assessment for EL. Most of the accommodations are the same from this year to last year. There have been a few minor changes, and then we'll go through that. And then this is a relatively short presentation, and I do understand that the hot topic this year, as always, is speech to text, and I'll leave some time for that at the end. And I just wanted to let you know I do not see the chat box, so if someone wants to read me chats at various pauses through here with questions, please feel free to, oh, there, I found it finally. Sorry, everyone. That if you have questions, please do feel free to post them so that way we can answer your questions as we go through this. So anyway, again, my name is Mindy Roden, or Melinda Roden. And I'm the special education assessment consultant with the assessment unit here at CDE. And we're going to start today with just an overview of, let me, if I can get my slide to, there we go. If I can get my slide to move, with some of the laws that do guide how we interact with students' personally identifiable information, especially in this world with technology. And so we're going to start there and then move on to the different assessments. Okay, so there are basically, there are lots of assessment laws, but there's basically two laws that specifically deal with children's personally identifiable information, or what we refer to as PII. And that is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, which is a federal law, and then the Colorado Student Data Transparency and Security Act, which is a Colorado state law. Okay, and so under COPPA, personally identifiable information basically means a photograph, video, or audio file when such file contains a child's image or voice. So basically, when we are talking about students' private information, we need to be careful about emailing or texting, or I know we don't text, but if we have work phones, texting information, emailing information. When we record a student in classrooms, whether it be voice or image, all that information is protected under the federal law. And basically what it means is that we have to be really careful. So if anything in that image or anything in that voice file or anything in that email or text can identify a student from that piece of information, even if it's not everything about that student, but if somebody else were to read it and be able to guess who that student was, we're actually violating the student's privacy. So we do need to be careful when transmitting information about our students. In Colorado, the Colorado law basically refers to how vendors collect information. And so we still have to be careful because a lot of our districts have Google accounts. And so sometimes we throw things up on Google Docs, but we realize, but unless your district has a really secure Google agreement, anything that is placed on the internet, Google owns, Apple owns, anything like that. So we do have to be careful about that kind of information that we're throwing up there. So basically vendors, including Pearson, which is our largest test vendor, or College Board, are not allowed to solicit information from the students and then use that to advertise to them or anything like that. Actually, I believe it was one of the southern states. I cannot remember if it was Mississippi, Alabama, but it was pretty sure it was a southern state. They actually reached out and sued Google because Google was collecting information about our students and then targeting advertising in those Google search boxes afterwards, specifically to those kids' search preferences. And it's one thing if we do that at home as an adult, but to be targeting our kids with targeted ads is a completely different thing. So in Colorado, in general. As you can see by the language on the page, we are not allowed to collect information that has personally identifiable information, with the caveat being that if you work with students who have a disability and maybe English learners as well, the WIDA Access Assessment for English learners has a speaking part to that test, and that system is locked down and secure. So that's what allows that the WIDA system to collect information. So. Okay, and basically CDE's assessment policy is that we have restricted internet access on our assessments since the CSAP TCAP days, and we do continue to do so. And our language here, it says from Spring 2018 manual, the 2019 manual was just released, and the language is actually exactly the same. So if you are planning on assessing your students with assistive technology, whether it be speech to text, word prediction, Zoom for students with visual impairments, adaptive keyboards, adaptive mouse, anything like that, it cannot connect to the internet. And if it does, we would need to know about it here at CDE. So do reach out to your district assessment coordinator if you have questions specifically about what you're allowed to use or not. But we're going to go through that a little bit more here in a second. Okay, so we're going to start with our assessments and what accommodations are. And accommodations are practices and procedures that provide equitable access during instruction and assessment for students with a documented need, including students with a disability. And just as an FYI, in Colorado, that documentation is either an IEP or a 504, and in certain instances, it does include a medical plan. So for our students who might have a blood sugar monitoring device or something like that for a medical condition, that does count if they have a documented medical plan. But REDAC plans don't count. ALPs, we don't use those because basically we provide accommodations for students with a documented disability and for a small subset of English learners. And the stipulations for an accommodation are they do need to be determined on an individual basis. They do need to be documented. They do need to be evaluated regularly for effectiveness, and we need to use it for both instruction and assessment according to the guidelines through CDE Special Education Unit. Okay, they are not intended to give an advantage or to reduce our learning expectations. So in order to apply for an accommodation such as text-to-speech for our students, they do need to have targeted instruction on reading intervention, because if we're saying that they can't read well enough to access a 4th or 5th grade test, then we need to be working on something to overcome that disability, and that would include targeted reading instruction with reading goals. So if we're not working on it outside of class, you can't just have it, basically. They're not intended to help students do better. We need to know that they work. So basically, sometimes we'll get requests for accommodations and the student wouldn't qualify for it with the accommodation. And we say, hey, I need something with unaccommodated data. And you might have to go back and retest the student without the accommodation because we need to make sure it's actually working. And then, or used for the convenience of the adult. Never would we want to assign a scribe to a student just because they write really slow or they keyboard slowly. So we want to always make sure that this is not for the benefit of the student, or not for the benefit of the adult, but for the benefit of the student. It's not that we have difficulty scheduling how to test these kids, and so we can't figure it out. So we give them accommodations. We put them all in the exact same small group or something instead of testing them one-to-one. But that we really look at the student as an individual before we move on. Do I have any questions about accommodations and who they're intended for so far? Okay, so the question is, if a student has word prediction as an accommodation, but they do not have a specific writing goal, but they need it for access due to reduced motor abilities, they could not use word prediction. It would depend on the specific situation. If they are using a speech-to-text device because they cannot keyboard, that's a different situation. Because of physical ability, that's a different thing. So in limited cases, depending on the student's ability to keyboard or even access a keyboard, because I do know we have students out there who cannot even access a keyboard, then that student would be able to have it. Because that's a long-term condition, basically, or sometimes we have students with degenerative conditions, and it's not necessarily a case of we're providing instruction as much as we're trying to maintain skill. So in certain cases, it's different. Okay, if I can find my cursor, sorry. Okay. Okay, so UARs are specifically for constructed response on the ELA assessment for CMS, for reading of the reading test on the ELA and CMS assessments, and a calculator usage on the non-calculator portion of the CMS math assessments. These three UARs do also work with College Board assessments at 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. So if they're in the IEP and the need is documented, then that serves as the documentation once we get to high school for the College Board assessments as well. But here in Colorado, our assessments are based on a foundation that the vast majority of our kids in school can access the test as designed and don't need accommodations or accessibility features. And then we have what we call administrative considerations, and these really don't impact anything. So it doesn't matter to us if your small group is 3 kids or 20 kids, because in an urban school district, a school might have 150 fifth graders, and in a rural school district, they might have 30 fifth graders. So the grouping for us doesn't matter so much because it doesn't really impact anything. And it doesn't matter to us if your students your students are better performers first thing in the morning, or they're better performers after they've come back from a PE, or they're better performers, or they're just calmer at a certain time of day. You can schedule that based on their needs. And those are the type of things that, because it doesn't affect anything, any student can have it. The same goes with accessibility features. And on the CMS assessments, the WIDA access assessments and our College Board assessments, there are certain accessibility features that are built into the technology platform, such as text-to-speech for math, science, and social studies, color contrast, enlargement or zoom. Any of those things are available for any student who needs it. However, we would caution just giving it to every student, because not every kid will want to use it, and some kids just play with those accessibility features. But again, things like text-to-speech, color contrast, anything like that, those are things that, once again, since we're not measuring your ability to read science, we're measuring your ability to know science. We allow text-to-speech for science, social studies, and math, because we're not interested in your ability to read the math problem as much as we want you to be able to calculate it. Then we have accommodations, which are tied specifically to an IEP, such as a student must have an IEP in order to have extended time. They must have, obviously, you would think large print and braille. You need an IEP. And then unique accommodations are those accommodations saved specifically for students who have an IEP or a 504. And again, that's reading of the reading test, writing or speech to text on the writing on the constructed response portion, and a calculator on the non-calculator section of the math test. Okay, so let's go for our assessments. We do offer there's all sorts of state assessments that are out there, such as TS Gold, some other literacy assessments, but those are run through different offices and are not used for accountability purposes. The ones that we use for accountability purposes and that are in state and federal law are run through the Unit of Student Assessment, include Access for ELLs, including the kindergarten and alternate access, CMS for math, ELA literacy, including CSLA, which stands for Colorado Spanish Language Arts, which is available for 3rd and 4th graders if they're NEP, LEP Spanish speakers. And then we have science and social studies. We have our co-alt assessments, which we have ELA in math and science and social studies. The ELA in math assessment is offered through our vendor DLM, which is an online computer-based test, where our science and social studies assessment is a paper-based test. The Colorado PSAT 9 and 10, along with the SAT, And then the alternate to that assessment, since College Board does not provide their own alternate, is we use the DLM, ELA, and math assessment as the alternate, and the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Education Progress. And that is only, we sample a select number of schools every other year. And this is a NAEP testing year, and your school should have been notified if they were selected or not already. Okay, so we're going to start with WIDA. This is an online or paper version of the test, and your district does get to choose which version they would like to give. The kindergarten and the alternate access are paper-based assessments. They do have their own accessibility and accommodation supplement, which I have the link on the slide, so if you do have any questions about what they offer. Because most of our districts do use the online assessment for WIDA, there are certain things that are available built into the system and certain things that aren't from a technology perspective. The one thing to know that for either the online or the paper-based version, if you have a student who has an AAC device, WIDA does allow that student to respond to the assessment using that AAC device, because they look at that as the student's normal speech output. If that's how the student generates speech, then that is allowed on the assessment. So the AAC is allowed specifically under language by WIDA. Okay, so here's a list of the accommodations by version of the test. And so the domain over there, it says L, R, or W, or S, depending on what you're looking at. It stands for listening, reading, speaking, and writing. So there are different accommodations available to different portions of the test. And partially that's because certain things are just appropriate. So you don't necessarily need a scribe on the speaking portion of the test, because it's just not what we're measuring. So there's a Braille version for the paper test, extended time, manual control, all those kind of things. So given our population of students, if you have a student who happens to be identified as an English learner and has an IEP for speech specifically, so our students who might either speak slower or have a stutter or something like that, the manual control of item audio is an important thing to know about, because what this basically does is gives a longer speaking response time within the system. If not, the default setting is just, and I actually don't know how long the default setting is for, but it's a certain number of seconds long. And when we have manual control of the item audio or the extended speaking test response time, those are for our kids who might have speech IEPs. And so that's really important to know for that. And also word processor or external device. So if you have a student who needs a different type of keyboard or doesn't interact with the typical desktop in a certain way, they can actually keyboard the responses into an external device and then have it transferred to the online or paper test. Okay, so the kindergarten and the next slide over will be the alternate access. Their accommodations are a little bit different because they're actually built into the testing platform. So it can be a little confusing when it says these accommodations are available, because there's nothing to mark, because the test was designed with the concept of universal design, and it was designed to be accessible for all kids. So extended testing time, extended speaking time, human readers, that kind of thing are available, and they're basically built into the test, because the kindergarten test and the alternate are both read to the student. Okay, and then some prohibited activities specifically for WIDA are: you cannot translate the test items into any language other than English, reading test items in a language other than English. So you do have to, this is an English proficiency exam, and we're specifically measuring our students' ability to read, write, and speak in English. So everything basically has to be in English. They prohibit a bilingual word-to-word dictionary, and they must answer their questions in English. Do we have any questions about the WIDA assessments before we move on? I will give this PowerPoint to the SWAAAC group for posting or distribution. So we'll make sure you guys get a copy of it for use. A very similar version of this is also already available on our CDE assessment units training website. Okay. So now we're going to go into CMS Accommodations, which is probably CMS and College Board are the two that we kind of spend the most time thinking about because that's where the vast majority of our students fall into. So under CMS, we do divide our accommodations, sorry about that, into different categories. We have administrative considerations, accessibility features, presentation and response accommodations, timing and scheduling accommodations, and then a small number of students who are identified as EL can also have accommodations. Anything that is an accommodation does require an IEP or 504, except for the very tiny number of accommodations for EL students. But administrative and accessibility features are available to any student, whereas the presentation, response, and timing and scheduling accommodations are specifically for students identified with having a disability. So examples of administrative considerations, we talked about these earlier, which could be small group testing, time of day, separate or alternate locations, specialized equipment, furniture, anything like that, frequent breaks. Frequent breaks do not stop the testing clock. So these are the kind that are those 30-second stand up, stretch, touch your toes, and sit back down kind of breaks. The students don't interact and they don't leave the testing environment, and it really doesn't take too much time out of the testing unit time. Adaptive and specialized equipment or furniture, we do allow adaptive keyboards or special mouse, like my mother-in-law and Heather Lobos Pavia, who's our EL specialist. They use that mouse with the trackball in it. I use a Bluetooth mouse, anything like that. You can just kind of have that because it's considered specialized equipment. When I first started here, we had things like pencil grips on the list, and since those should just be things that any kid could have. I prefer a fat pencil. My daughter likes a super skinny one. That's just a preference. So those are no longer considered accommodations, but just things that kids can have. Okay, so the only thing that changed on the accessibilities from last year is we no longer offer answer masking. Everything else is still the same. Answer masking, we actually looked at the data. Pearson pulled a report, and we literally had no kid use it last year whatsoever on the CMS assessment. So we eliminated as one of the potential tools or toys. Some of our kids, we do get reports from students playing with the tools so much that almost like it's a toy, so they forget to take their test. And if you've been on any of my other webinars, you'll know I use my daughter as an example frequently, and she's a good test taker, enjoys challenging herself, and her first year taking the CMS science assessment as an 8th grader, she basically played with the accessibility tools for so long that she forgot to take her test and almost didn't finish her unit. So when talking to your students about all these kind of neat tools and features that are built into the platform, just make sure that they know that they can be a distraction if they're not using them on a daily basis. But there's audio amplification, color contrast, answer eliminator, which is the big red X that goes across the answer items. So if you're talking with your students about how do we know, like if you are looking at an item that has 4 or 5 or 6 answer options, how do we know, and you're down to 2 or 3, you can use that answer eliminator to put a big red X over the ones that you know are wrong. Frequent breaks, general administration directions read aloud, repeated, or clarified. So basically, what we now call the say directions. If you're proctoring this assessment and a student says, can you repeat that? You're allowed to do that for all the kids. Highlight tool, headphones, and noise buffers. However, and you are not to allow them to play music through those. They literally need to be noise buffers. But if you have a student in the class who typically use them on a regular basis, they can just have them. We do have magnification and enlargement, pop-up glossaries. Students are allowed to use an external spell check device as long as it does not connect to the internet. We can, again, as I mentioned earlier, they can have text-to-speech for math, science, and social studies. This is where we get a lot of questions, is the time and a half for science and social studies. So a unit time in science and social studies, because we've been doing this for long enough and we've been in control of science and social studies for the last, I think, 6 years now. We know how long it takes a kid to complete a unit. We have data points. We know who our outliers are. And we build in that time and a half. If you are working with a student who needs extended time, I have a chart that will be posted on the CDE website that you can pull down, or reach out to your district assessment coordinator or your school assessment coordinator for access to the information, and it will give you that amount of time that you can talk about it with parents. We do also have scripts for reading and signing for math, science, and social studies, because once again, we're not measuring your ability to read on the math test, we're measuring your ability to calculate or do math problem solving. And then we have writing tools such as spell check, underlining, bold, highlighting, all those type of things that we would use from a Word document are also available. Okay, presentation accommodations. We do allow the use of assistive technology. We have an assistive technology form that is compatible with certain types of assistive technology for ELA and math only. We do not offer an assistive technology form for science or social studies because it still doesn't work well enough for us to run our simulations in science on. So we'd rather have students use a separate device, which I know can create some hassles having enough devices in your building, but we'd rather have it be a smooth testing administration process. And on that note, Pearson eliminated their browser-based testing. So some of the devices that you used to be able to use with the AT form are not necessarily working with the current form. So if you are planning on using a speech to text with a student for CMS testing, you're going to want to think about using a separate device. They tested Co-Writer Universal in online and offline mode, and they tested Text Helps Read Write in online and offline mode, and they are not working really well. Zoom is working okay for our screen readers, which is actually the most critical piece, since that's the only way our students can access the test. That works fine, and then for some reason, Dragon Naturally Speaking works fine. I think it has to do with what type of programming language they're using on the background, and I think it has something to do with Java. Okay, auditory presentation or text-to-speech or oral script for readers or signers is UAR, which is a unique accommodation for ELA only. So going to that question that I have right now, which is oral scripts available for anyone. Oral scripts for math, science, and social studies, once again, are available for anyone because we're not measuring your ability to read on the math, science, or social studies test. We also have text-to-speech available for anyone for those 3 content areas. Text-to-speech or scripts or signing for ELA, where we are actually measuring your ability to read, those are through a unique accommodation request process. We do have Braille test. A student can have a signer for test directions without that being a UAR, because that's the same as the say directions being read out loud. And then we also offer large print. Okay. So our large print is in Braille, I know, but mostly TVIs, but sometimes we, as technology coordinators or as people working with students who need different types of assistive technology, we do offer it's compatible with Zoom. We have it built in, and then it's compatible with the Zoom text or the or with JAWS, and then other enlargement options. We can always project it onto a whiteboard or onto the wall, or you can use a magnifier on a paper test. So for those students with visual impairments, we can get really creative on how to make sure they can access their assessment. Response accommodations, once again, we do allow assistive technology. We allow braillers and note takers, talking, calculator, abacus, manipulatives, a calculation device, and math charts and counters. For the non-calculator portion of the math test is a UAR. A speech to text, we still do not want it to connect to the internet, and I'm not ignoring your question that I saw, but I figured we'd just wait to the end because I'm sure you're not the only one with that question. A scribe or a signer for the constructed response portion of the ELA assessment is a UAR, and then word prediction. You can have that as long as it's not, again, internet-based. So timing and scheduling accommodations, once again, are for students who have an IEP or a 504. Multiple breaks, which is the language we use for a stop the clock break. Extended time. Everybody needs to complete their testing unit in 1 day. We do not allow you to continue a unit for more than 1 day. We surprisingly get a large number of requests to allow the kid to test for 6.5 hours and they're still not finished and they need to keep going. And at that point in time, we need to balance the loss of instructional time against how much time they're spending in testing, and is there really any benefit, or do we have test fatigue? So now if we have students who have medical conditions such as seizures, diabetes, we have kids who are on chemo, all that kind of thing, at that point in time, you just put them in a regular testing environment, and let's say their blood sugar is off and they need to leave because they need to go have a snack. At that point in time, we have a process for excusing a student for being ill, and they're allowed to make that up later. But we really want to think about that accessibility feature, which is the administrative considerations about timing and scheduling. So we want to try to test when the student is most stable. Double time for all 4 content areas, and then time and a half for ELA and math. And then once again, time and a half is built in for science and social studies for all students. Accommodations for EL students are limited to those students identified as NEP or LEP, which stands for Not English Proficient or Limited English Proficient. And again, some of these say that they can just have because they're an EL student, and then things such as speech to text, they have to have an IEP and a 504 or a 504. So certain things they qualify, they're allowed to have because they're an English learner, and other accommodations are limited to basically the only reason they get it is because they're English learner with the disability. So it gets a little bit tricky sometimes pulling apart who's eligible for what. So again, this will be posted and you can kind of just look at this at a glance and then just see who needs what. CSLA is treated as an accommodated version of the ELA form. So it's only available to 3rd and 4th graders for students who qualify. And basically, this is a measure of the student's ability to read and write in Spanish. And the reason we offer this in 3rd and 4th grade only, Heather Villalobos-Sevilla and I presented at the COTESL, which is the Colorado Association of Teachers of Students of Other Language conference last week. And somebody asked us why we didn't offer the CSLA in 5th grade. And basically, it's because it's in law that we allow it in 3rd and 4th grade. So that's where we have it. It is a paper-based assessment. So if you have a student who, for example, needs word prediction or uses speech to text or other assistive technology, maybe they have limited use or have poor pencil grip and so the keyboard, those are all accommodations that are allowed based on an IEP of 504, and then you would transfer it into the test booklet for the student. Unique accommodations, or UARs, are only for students who have an active IEP or 504. They do need to have recent data documenting the need and the use, and recent is defined as being from this current school year. We actually do not take eligibility for special education data. We take the equivalent of benchmark data. So sometimes people will send me a Woodcock Johnson from 2 years ago, and I'll deny the UAR because the data is not recent. And they'll argue with me about it because they're thinking eligibility for special education, but there should be something that the classroom teacher or the specialist is providing that provides benchmark points about their progress on their IEP goals or their reading or their math or their ability to write. These are due to me by December 15th, and they must be submitted through your district assessment coordinator in a batch process because they must be securely transmitted. This is very personal data. So I know that as a provider, especially for some of our students with some interesting disabilities, that we provide some interesting technology in order to help them access their instruction. And you want to describe this kiddo to me in the fullest detail, which I do completely get and completely understand. However, do not send me their IEP, because I do not need to see everything about that student because it is PII. And even though I work for the state, I don't need to know everything about that kid. I don't need to know that they bounced out of 5 foster homes before they were at 7 or something like that. That is personal. And I just basically need benchmark scores, writing samples, keyboarding, things like that, that kind of present the academic picture of that student. I don't need their IEP or their social emotional history. I don't need a 10-page letter from their psychiatrist telling me why they should have something. So because that's all very personal information about a student. And as a parent of a student who used to be on an IEP, I don't know if I would want me to look at that same information from the other side. So anyway. Okay. Again, I mentioned this earlier. We have ELA, and for ELA literacy, we have the scribe for constructed response. We have auditory presentation, reader, signer. And again, this is only for ELA. So those scripts and that text to speech is available for the other content areas, and math calculator on the non-calculator sections. So this last year, we adopted new standards. There are revised reading, writing, communicating standards that were adopted in the spring of 2018. And there are active conversations occurring about the implications for assessment and unique accommodations, specifically around the auditory presentation of the test and speech to text and scribing. So what that means in a lot of words is that currently we allow text to speech and in certain instances speech to text, but the instructional committees are talking about whether that continues to be appropriate or not. And that is not a decision coming from assessment. That is a decision coming from the READAC folks and the special education staff and the people in standards and instruction. And they are having conversations about what it means to be a reader and what it means to be a writer. Right now, for the 2019, we are going on as we have in past years, which means text to speech is a thing and speech to text is a thing. So I'm just throwing that out there so you guys have some awareness of the conversations. If you want to, and I actually don't know exactly I'm not participating in them personally, so I can't even tell you exactly who's participating in them, but if you want to reach out to somebody with comments or concerns or questions, please feel free to do so. But again, it's the special education unit, the ELA staff members in our standards and instruction unit, the READAC folks are basically the instructional components of CDE are talking about what it means to be a reader and what it means to be a writer. Okay. So the submission process, you don't really need to know about this so much besides to get this to your DAC or your SAC or your building principal, whatever your process is within your school district for being forwarded to the DAC in time to get it to me by the December 15th deadline. And then this is a common question from providers. So if you have a student who moves in from out of state, you can submit a UAR after the December 15th deadline. So I know we get a lot of January students who move here in January. And then also, if you have a student who you already had on an IEP in your district, but the team meets, let's say they meet in February, mid-February, and the IEP is changed, you can submit that UAR to your DAC for submission to me as well, because that kind of falls into the new student category because they now have a different IEP with different goals. So we'll take a UAR in that case. So anytime the IEP is changed or somebody moves into your district, you can submit the UAR after that December 15th deadline. And I do want to make sure you guys are aware of that, because if a student really needs something, we do want them to have it. Okay, So we're going to talk about this for just a second. We still have College Board assessments and co-alt, and I know we're running a little bit behind. I do think it's important to talk about this. So I do know that we say internet access is restricted, and I know that. Some of our districts have received waivers for the internet access. That request has to come through your DAC and your DTC, which is your district technology coordinator. There are a lot of rules in place because we have to protect the students' personally identifiable information. So the only way that this can happen is you have to have very strict security agreements with whoever your internet provider is in order to ensure that the student's voice that their voice is protected. There's also a rigorous security protocol that your district technology coordinator has to go through to set up restricted access to restricted accounts. There are new accounts that have to be created. We have had a few waivers granted this last year because we do acknowledge the fact that we are going more technology based. However, so I'm letting you guys know that there is a process in place. Those requests do come to me, get funneled through me, and then I bring them to leadership for review of documentation and things like that. The other thing that your teacher, you as the teacher or you as the proctor or the provider or whatever your role is in the district, have to be willing to sign off on saying that you ensure that the student is using only the program that the district has put out there. We have had a few cases where the district told us they were going to do one thing and the classroom teachers actually did something completely opposite. So we're a little hesitant to make it out there. And just to address that question, how is this not giving certain districts advantages? One, if your student truly needs speech to text to access the test, they're mitigating the disability. It's not used to increase test scores. We're using it so that the student can actually show what they know and can do. If they're really using it on a regular basis, and that's why I'm more putting it out there, because we don't want it hidden. We're not necessarily screaming it from the rooftops because, again, this is a leadership decision, and some districts have chosen not to request that waiver. So many of the districts out there know that the other districts have gotten approval and they choose not to act on it, and that is a leadership decision within the districts, because some districts do not want that for their students. The security agreement, that is federal law, so there is nothing that I can do because I cannot knowingly allow you to violate federal law. So denying small districts, because you may be actually violating federal law by allowing your students to access certain speech to text programs anyway. So that's one of those things that as a state employee, I cannot advocate for violating federal law, and it is my job to advocate for the strictest protections for those students. So that is one of those unfortunate circumstances that may or may not be fair to students, but as a employee of the state, I cannot knowingly violate federal law. And if we don't have those protections in place with the students, then that's unfortunate for that student, unfortunately. I know that's one of those things. Is the waiver the only option for districts using web-based options? I'm not sure about what that question is. So actually, if you would like to use a web-based program for your students, your DAC and your district testing, or your district technology coordinator are going to need to work together to figure out a very secure system for access, yes. Software, the text help desktop-based version now comes as part of the internet-based version, is my understanding. So you get, when you buy the license, you get both desktop and internet-based version. Co-Writer has an offline test mode for Co-Writer 7 and Co-Writer Universal. Both have an offline testing mode. The student builds their word bank and it's saved, and then they can access this word bank during the test. And then there's not an actual waiver process as much as your DAC just needs to reach out to me here at CDE, and we'll talk them through the process. There's not one form because, again, this may or may not be, since this is kind of a transition year and we're not sure what those conversations are going to look like, we don't have a formal process in place because we're not sure what's going to happen. if nothing changes in future years, I'm sure we will formalize this process. This was a way of trying to be responsive to some of our districts that are Chromebook only districts. So we're just trying to figure it out, because I do know we do have some districts out there that are Chromebook based only. So you can't run a desktop app off of a Chromebook. I think I've addressed, as these questions are popping up in the chat box. CoWriter 7, it's a product from Text Help. It's called Google Read Write, an extension for Chrome. My understanding, I believe they were at the SWAAAC in-person conference a couple of springs ago, about a year and a half ago, and they were doing a presentation. We went to look at it last fall, and they now, as part of their license, you get a desktop app as well as a the internet access. The other thing, so you guys know, I have a specific UAR for those students who are unable to train the desktop-based version. So so let's say you are diligently working with a desktop-based version of Text Help, and your students' reading ability is so low that they can't train the device. You can reach out to your DAC, and we don't, and then I have a specific UAR that will allow us to scribe at the last minute for that student, because they can't get that device they can't get that desktop version trained well enough, because basically you have to read you have to read a long passage, and the system recognizes the voice and learns how that particular student pronounces certain words. We have had some districts use the desktop-based versions of Text Help and test, actually this particular district tests more kids on speech to text than any other district in the state, and they actually do not use the online version, they use the desktop-based version. But what they do is they actually work with the teachers early in the fall, and they train those devices early and often. And like I said, Universal has a desktop-based version that I know of. All right, the one thing I do have to say is Google Docs, the voice input on Google Docs is not allowed. So for some of our districts are using Google Docs, and the teachers are just putting them on Google Docs because it works fairly well. And I acknowledge that. It's just like if you get Word to read a document, it works really well. So those are all options. For those of you struggling with we use Google Docs, and now you're saying I can't, the licenses for Dragon Actually Speaking and the Text Helps, Read Write, and then CoWriter, they're actually not all that expensive. That's easy for me to say sitting here, and I do realize that. So for that final question, before we move on, if a student is using a desktop-based version of CoWriter, they are going to need a separate device. CoWriter was one of the devices that Pearson ran a check on, and it's not compatible with the TestNav app any longer. That used to run through the browser-based testing, which is no longer a thing. As much as Colin Bonner, who is our IT guy here in our office, and I have met with Pearson, it's where they went. So anyway, all right. Yeah, and Text Help also is not compatible, so you're going to have to think about a separate device. I would plan for most people to have a separate device for Assistive Technology if you are using speech to text. Again, the ones I do know that were compatible were the JAWS worked, and for our students who use screen readers, and Dragon Actually Speaking worked. CoWriter Universal did not work, and Text Help did not work. So we'll need separate devices for those. All right, we're going to go through this really quickly because we have about 12 minutes left. Okay. So you can read any part of the test for a CoAlt student. You can use representative objects or pictures. You can program it into their AAC device, anything like that, because the CoAlt is allowed to be flexible as long as we're not interfering with the construct being measured. in the ELA and math, which again is that computerized system offered through the DLM, they have magnification, color overlay, inverts, color choice, masking, and text-to-speech. They're single and double switch compatible. So I don't know how many of you help your classroom teacher set up switches or AAC devices, but that does work with the system. And then accommodations provided outside of the system are read aloud, sign interpretation, partner assisted scanning, and the teacher can enter the response for the student if they don't know how to work a mouse, or they tend to be click happy and grab the mouse. So all of that is allowed. Practices that are explicitly prohibited on the DLM assessment are whole word or sentence dictation, speech to text, picture word banks, or hand-over-hand guidance. And those first three bullets are specific to the ELA assessment. They are allowed on the math assessment. So the DLM vending system does not allow speech to text for the ELA portion of the ELA assessment for COALT. DLM also has their own accessibility manual, which is provided. And then COALT accommodations indicated in PA Next are assistive technology, including high and low tech devices. I know that we think of AT and we think about technology, but if you have the old school PEC systems or the carry around a picture board, anything like that, old school also is out there. PSAT and SAT. So we do not approve the accommodations for the PSAT and SAT. Those go directly through the College Board into the SSD system. So if you're a high school level teacher, make friends with your guidance counselor or whoever is in charge of that. It does need to be documented in the IEP, but if the student has been using it through 8th grade CMS assessments, most of the things will be compatible with the College Board assessments in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. Last year, we did have several students who their team forgot to apply for accommodations through the SSD system for College Board, and therefore they did not receive the accommodations they thought they were going to get. So luckily in 9th grade, it's almost going to be considered a practice year because those scores don't go to colleges anyway. If the student is, say, a 10th grader and you did submit them in 9th grade, those accommodations are just considered approved. State allowed accommodations must be approved each year, and College Board is only offering UEB for students requiring Braille. The one thing I did reach out to Will Morton and Jared Anthony about any technology issues. College Board is still offering an MP3 player because it remains a paper pencil based test, and you can have so their read aloud option is either a human reader or an MP3 audio file that the student listens to and follows along. They are allowed to keyboard. If they take the essay, they are allowed to keyboard the written response if it's documented in the IEP, and they are allowed speech to text, but that does have to go through the approval process. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is a lot of the accommodations are the same under college reportable score and state allowed. So make sure whoever is putting that information into the SSD system goes ahead and applies for the college reportable accommodations versus the state allowed accommodations, because for example, human reader is available under both state allowed and college reportable. But if you put it under state allowed, that even though that accommodation is allowed under both systems, College Board will not retroactively apply that accommodation and generate a college reportable score. So we want to make sure that we're not limiting our students' options for college because we applied for the wrong thing. And I know that's a little bit confusing. So we do want to make sure that they have that. Okay. They're not all available at so it is paper-based, so obviously text-to-speech is not available, but a human reader is, or again, they have that MP3 audio file. When in doubt, use the open-ended box and enrich. So I always get, well, how do I know they're going to take it? Because College Board has College Board has a list of over 100 accommodations, and we cannot list them all in the enriched IEP system. When in doubt, write it down in that open-ended box. There's a box that you can check other accommodations needed, and a box will pop open. And so when in doubt, documented there. And as I said, on the last slide basically is that you can't change from state allowed to college reportable after the fact. So we want to make sure that the highest level of access is applied for so that we can make sure all of our students have scores for college admission, even if we don't think they're going to college. And the NAEP, students with disabilities are expected to participate in the NAEP sample, and only students eligible for co-alt may be exempted. And they do have similar accommodations, but they may not be called the same thing. If your school has been selected for NAEP, Colin Bonner, who is our new NAEP coordinator, as well as our IT guy, will be doing a webinar with your school and district staff, and they'll convey any information back to you guys that they feel like the teachers do need to know. So from final points on accommodations, more is not necessarily better, and not all accommodations benefit all students. So I was talking with one of our DACs, or district assessment coordinators, earlier today, and we were noticing a trend, and accommodations seem to be assigned because the teacher likes them, not necessarily because the student needs them. So I had a situation where somebody asked about students being able to listen to music during testing, and I said, sure, fine, that's okay, under certain parameters. And then I said, how many kids are we talking about? And he said, 10. I said, I don't have 10 kids all year long across the state who asked for this accommodation. It turns out this teacher put that particular accommodation on every student's IEP in their classroom. So at that point, we have to figure out if it's something the teacher thinks is beneficial, or does the student really benefit from it? And then it's the same thing where the DAC I talked to today was telling me that their provider was actually like, oh, I never read to any of my students because all kids want a human reader. And once again, that's the teacher just making a determination because she or he didn't agree with that particular accommodation and was more of the suck it up and do it kind of person. So we want to make sure that the accommodations are actually considered at the individual student level, and that even though I might like a particular accommodation and I might think it's helpful, that I need to have data showing it actually benefits the student, and I'm thinking of that student as an individual. Accommodations that are not provided during instruction will not benefit the student on the test. So speaking of speech to text, which is obviously the hot topic over the last year or so, I had a DAC reach out and say, which program should I use? And I said, well, what does the kid use instructionally? And the kid wasn't using anything instructionally, and the team had just added it to the IEP for testing only. And so the student does need to use that accommodation, whether it be speech to text, text to speech, extended time. They need to be using it daily during instruction and not just for testing. If it's in the IEP, the student must be offered it. Now, they can refuse it, and if they do refuse it, you need to document it at the local level and let your DAC and your SAC know. If the student is refusing this accommodation on a regular basis, I would highly encourage the team get back together and discuss whether or not it's appropriate. I taught middle school, well, in Arizona, it was called junior high, and I taught mostly 8th graders, and I had a student who was TBI, and he had a twin brother. He had been in a car accident, and his twin brother was not in the car accident and was in all general education classes. And the student hated anything to do with special services because he thought it made him look different. So I actually ended up talking to the mom, and we discontinued services and just monitored him through a 504 because the student was actually working so hard not to be different that he was actually impacting his own education. So we do want to make sure that the student, I get reports every year of the student refusing to go to their small group, or they don't want to go to the extended time room or anything like that. So we do want to make sure that the students do actually want to use the accommodation, and not that the team thinks it's a great idea. If you have assessment accommodation questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Sometimes I cannot answer your question specifically because we have guidelines and we have certain rules, obviously, but then certain districts are allowed to implement them as they choose. For example, we have some districts who, even though they have NEP, LEP, students who read and write in Spanish at 3rd and 4th grade, they choose not to test their students using the CSLA. They instead put them on the regular English test. So those are district-based questions. So sometimes I will refer you back to your DAC or your SAC for clarification, because some things are individual at the district level, and we only provide guidance. But feel free to reach out to me. And if you have any questions about instructional accommodations, please reach out to Gina Herrera in the Special Education Unit at CDE. And my understanding is that the new accommodations manual should be out soon, if it's not out yet. If you have any other questions, I'll stay on. I did finish exactly at 3:59. We have 1 minute to spare. So I will just sit here for a minute.
Belinda, thank you so much. That was quite a marathon. I'm impressed.
Yeah, there's a lot of information.
If you didn't join us right at the beginning, we are asking that you type your first and last name into the chat. It is how we are verifying attendance. It looks like most of you have, but if you didn't hear that, just take a quick minute and give us your name so that we can make sure to get you a certificate. Hi, Betty.
Okay, let me see. Can you repeat the speech-to-text and text-to-speech programs are currently allowed on CMS? Do you project to view this way next year? Do you recommend districts consider non-based? As of now, we usually would recommend non-web-based tools just for safety's sake, because once again, depending on what your district decides to do, your leadership may determine that they don't want to request internet-based speech-to-text or go through the process of setting up the secure accounts, or they may not have the staff. So we always recommend desktop-based versions first because of the safety issues and the PII and violating students' information with throwing things up on the internet. We have to be really careful with that. So let me go back a few questions here. Extensions aren't allowed on CMS. Again, that's why we recommend a separate device. It's not necessarily compatible with the desktop-based app, so we are letting everybody know ahead of time that you're probably going to need to prepare for 2 devices. So that on that one, currently allowed on CMS, we don't have a list of things that are currently allowed per se, as much as we have a list of we know that if it can work on the desktop, we allow it without you checking in with us. So if you can get text help to work on your desktop for your student, or Dragon Naturally Speaking, or anything else that's out there to work on your desktop, then you can just use that without checking in with CDE. I do know that the most popular programs out there are Dragon Naturally Speaking, CoWriter Universal, and Text Help, their extension for Chrome, which is Read Write. We do not allow Snap and Read because we do require that you use our text-to-speech version of the test, not somebody else's text-to-speech, because ours is stable and it ensures a standardized administration of the test. Again, I cannot predict what it's going to be for next year, because I do know that instructionally there are various people outside of our department are having conversations, and that will impact our testing policy. As soon as we know something, we will share that. As of now, I don't have anything else to share that I haven't already talked about. All right, could someone please touch on how communication devices are allowed in the test? Communication devices, if your student has an AAC device, and that is how they, whether it be really simple for a student maybe with an intellectual disability, or really complicated for somebody maybe who has a severe cerebral palsy or something like that, if that is their normal means of communication, then they can just use that. We never want to restrict somebody's actual voice. So basically what you would do is the student would answer using that AAC device. If they say they're, let's just say they have severe cerebral palsy and they don't have controlled use of their hands, and so keyboarding is not really an option. So they have an AAC device that they use with eye gaze or something like that. You would just use that and transcribe their responses following the transcription procedures outlined in the procedures manual. Accommodations that are usually paired with something like that are probably extended time or stop the clock breaks, which is multiple breaks. And that's because there's more of a fatigue issue with that type of situation. I will make sure Christina has these slides to distribute. If the DAC is unsure how the two devices work, you can support them with that. Yes, basically what they do is they run the program through the one device. The student responds into that device. And then again, using the transcription procedures in the procedures manual, the teacher and basically an observer transfer that information into the student's test, either on their paper test book or into the online test. The Microsoft Word has a text-to-speech feature. Would this be allowed? No. Speech-to-text on Microsoft Word. I would have to look at it. It depends on how it functions. And I am not out in the field, and so I cannot speak to every program out there. I am happy to look at it. It depends on if you're using Google Docs, like Word through Google Docs, and that's not allowed. If you are actually speaking into the desktop version of the application, then probably. And I know that's not like 100% definitive answer. Nope, if it's a feature on Word. If it's a feature on Word itself, then it would be allowed. I use the text-to-speech feature in Word and PDF on a regular basis, and it does work pretty well because I check all our scripts against the test to make sure they're word for word. And what I use it for is I have Microsoft Word read me the document while I read it online with the test. So I'll play with that because it generally would be free. I do not believe so. You would have to contact our privacy officer, who is in a different department. If you have an agreement, you could run it through the CDE privacy officer and they could check it. If you send me an email, I can find out. I do not know who that person is off the top of my head. I think her name is Jill, but that's not helpful for you. So just send me an email and I'll get that information. All right, Christina, I know we're over. I think I got most of the questions.
Thanks so much, Mindy. All right, so we will go ahead and distribute the slides as soon as we get them. And if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out to any of us here at the SWAAAC Central Office. And thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Thanks.